between Percy and Melville than anything else, with that in mind. Well, I could start out with a thought experiment. You're a native of New York City. You live in New York, work in New York, travel about the city with no particular emotion except a mild boredom, unease, exasperation, and dislike, especially for, say, Times Square in Brooklyn, and a longing for a Connecticut farmhouse. You make enough money and move to a Connecticut farmhouse. Later, you become an astronaut and wander in space for years. You land on a strange, unexplored, you think, planet. There you find a road sign with an arrow erected by a previous astronaut in the manner of GIs in World War II. Brooklyn, 9.6 light years. Explain your emotion. Well, here's how one writer responds to this emotion. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking off people's hats. Then I account it high time to get to the sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the hip. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, sometime or another, cherish very nearly the same feelings toward the ocean with me. That, of course, is Melville's answer not simply to Percy's thought experiment, but in a certain sense the answer to, or the beginning the answer to, what the self is. If a man is already prone to anger, Dr. Tom Moore muses at the opening of Love of the Ruins, he'll go mad with rage. If he lives affrighted, he will quake with terror. If he's already abstracted from himself, he'll be sundered from himself and roam the world like Ishmael. Considering Percy's great concern for the untethered self in both his novels and his nonfiction work, it was inevitable that Ishmael, the luckless elder son of Abraham, doomed to wander in exile, would make an appearance in Percy's writing. 12 years after publishing Love in the Ruins, the implications of Isaac's bastard brother, a biblical character, Percy writes in his essay on Melville, kicked out into the desert with God's permission. That he might have inspired him to begin thinking about that other famous Ishmael of literature, the narrator of Moby Dick. Already drawn to Melville by an affinity for addressing the cosmos as a mystery, Percy makes it clear in his essay on Herman Melville that he sees great value in Melville because, as the author of Moby Dick, he sought to pierce that mystery with both pen and harpoon. In Melville, Percy sees a fellow writer who, like himself, conceives of narrative as a search, and each character as a reflection of the self confronted by the cosmos. As the narrative unfolds, Percy writes about Moby Dick. One becomes aware that in its very telling, something else is being told, a ghostly narrative of great import, told by a ghostly self, perhaps one's own shadow self. Percy's essay on Melville appeared in the New Criterion in 1983. That same year, he published Lost in the Cosmos, the last self-help book. Itself a weird hybrid of fiction and nonfiction, which in its own way is as every bit experimental as Moby Dick when it was first published in 1851. The coincidence of the two pieces of writing are not, I propose, merely a coincidence, but an indication that even as Percy was thinking about the self, he saw in Melville's work that same concern for self, which he would take up in his parody of self-help. Both Moby Dick and Lost in the Cosmos have an eclectic mix of thought experiments, narrative sidebars, scientific expositions, comic interludes, philosophical dialogues, and a big mess of red meat for theoreticians right in the middle of each. In Melville's case, a cetological, or study of cetology, and in Percy's case, a semiotic primer of the self. Alternately titled, among other things, The Strange Case of the Self, Yourself, the Ghost of Which Haunts the Cosmos, Lost in the Cosmos expands on many of the concerns addressed in Percy's Melville essay, including the notion of a ghostly self that Percy sees emerging of Melville's master narrative. Others have seen the same theme in Melville's masterpiece as well. Moby Dick unfolds before us as a story of a whale hunt. Howard P. Vincent writes in his book-length appraisal of the novel, The Trying Out of Moby Dick. And he wrote this novel, or this appraisal, roughly 40 years before 40 years before Percy's essay. And Vincent continues, and it becomes at the same time the quest of the human heart for its spiritual and psychological home. Indeed, throughout Moby Dick, Melville's character confront the same sort of mute mystery of the universe that riddles Percy's characters. Now, in calm weather, Melville writes, relating the story of Pip, the Pequod's castaway cabin boy, to swim in the ocean, in the open ocean, is as easy to the practiced swimmer as to ride in a spring carriage ashore. But the awful lonesomeness is intolerable. The intense concentration of self in the middle of such a heartless immensity. My God, who can tell it? As Percy sees it, we're all at one time or another that cabin boy Pip, swimming in the moderate malaise, unable to escape ourself, yet unable to define it either. The self is still problematical to itself, Percy writes, as he explains the predicament of the immanent self. But, he continues, the self solves its predicament of place vis-a-vis the world either by a passive consumership or by a discriminating transaction with the world and with informed interactions with other selves. Another way of looking at this, I suppose, would be to say, well, just as Percy divides the world into, or the selves of the world into immanence and transcendence, you could say that those who are immanent, those who are in the immanence of the world are those where the Pips of the world swim, and the transcendence is where the Ahabs of the world sail. The impoverishment of the immanent self, and this is again Percy writing, the impoverishment of the immanent self derives from a perceived loss of sovereignty to them, the transcending scientists and experts of society. As a consequence, the self sees its only recourse as an endless round of work, division, and consumption of goods and services. Failing this, and having some inkling of its plight, it sees no way out because it has come to see itself as an organism in which an environment, and so can't understand why it feels so bad in the best of all possible environments. Say, a good family, and a good home, in a good neighborhood, in East Orange, on a fine Wednesday afternoon. And so finds itself secretly relishing bad news, assassinations, plane crashes, and the misfortune of neighbors, and even comes secretly to hope for catastrophe, earthquake, hurricane, wars, apocalypse, anything to break out of the iron grip of imminence. Now, it might seem flippant to say, given the heat and specific gravity of Ahab's torment, that the one-legged mariner suffers from a bad case of Persean re-entry after transcendence. In fact, read in light of Lost in the Cosmos, Melville seems to suggest that Ahab finds re-entry impossible. All visible objects, man, are but as pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there some unknown but still unreasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall, shoved near to me. Sometimes I think there's naught beyond, but 'tis enough. He tasks me, he heaps me. I see in him outrageous strength with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. The inscrutable thing is chiefly what I hate. Well, in a certain sense, Melville, for that matter Ahab, is putting to the reader the same question Percy puts to the reader in Lost in the Cosmos. Why is Carl Sagan so lonely? Well, let's rephrase it. Why is Captain Ahab so lonely? Well, Captain Ahab is lonely because, after great expectations, he has not discovered extraterrestrial intelligences in the cosmos. Because chimpanzees don't talk, dolphins don't talk, and humpback whales sing only to other humpback whales, and, or in his case, sperm whales. And he has heard nothing but random noise in the cosmos. And because once everything in the cosmos, including man, is reduced to the sphere of immanence, matter in interaction, there is no one left to talk to except other transcending intelligence is from other worlds, or in Ahab's case, in the depths of the sea itself. While Sagan may see benignity in the cosmos, where Ahab sees malignity, in the end it comes to the same thing. Ahab and Sagan are both haunted by this inscrutable thing that can be neither possessed, in Sagan's case, or hunted down and destroyed, in Ahab's. And of course, both Sagan and Ahab failed, although obviously the jury is still out on whether the universe holds another intelligent race or whether they are intelligent enough to not contact us if they know what's good for them. Yet both failed because, as Percy notes, there is no room in the cosmos for an absolutely transcending objective mind, as Ahab seems to present himself to a certain extent, and an absolutely transcending God. But then, what to make of Ishmael himself? Is he suffering from Pip's immanence or Ahab's transcendence? Again, Howard Vincent provides a glimpse into the sort of thing that Percy also saw in Ishmael. Melville has atomized the various selves of every man Ishmael, this is Vincent writing, projecting each of them in a separate character within the novel. Stemming from Ishmael, Moby Dick is a study in both single and multiple personalities. It is concerned with the psychological phase of the problem of the one and the many. The very thing that is addressed by Percy in Lost in the Cosmos. As Percy understands the artist, the Melville-Ishmael predicament of one and many selves is applicable to the characters of Moby Dick because, Percy says, the artist caught in a predicament of the self is not at once more vulnerable to the predicament of self, than the non-artist, and at the same time privileged to escape it by the transcendence of his art. He serves others who share his predicament by naming it, that is, naming the inscrutable thing that Ahab chiefly hates. In other words, while Ishmael suffers as a splintered self, in telling the story, he also transcends that splintering and allows the reader to enter into the narrative and indeed into the other selves of the novel. But we know that Melville isn't only an artist, but also, like Percy to a certain extent, a scientist, an expert on cetology. Already we are boldly launched into the deep, but soon we shall be lost in its unshored, harborless immensities, Ishmael said. Ere that time comes to pass, at the outset it is but well to attend to a matter almost indispensable to a thorough, appreciative understanding of the more special, Leviathanic revelations and illusions of all sorts which are to follow. It is some systematized exhibition of the whale in his broad genera that I would now fain put before you. Yet it is no easy task. The classification of the constituents of a chaos, nothing less, is here essayed. Yet, even with the cetological chapters, Melville acknowledges, as Percy persistently does in Lost in the Cosmos, that science cannot have the final word, for it remains incapable of a perfect understanding of the universe. I promise nothing complete, Melville says in the same chapter 33, because any human thing supposed to be complete must for that very reason infallibly be faulty. I shall not pretend to a minute anatomical description of the various species, or in the space at least, too much of any description. I am the architect, not the builder. Like Melville, Percy also pleads a pedestrian account of theoretical knowledge, although in both cases we know better. The following section, an intermezzo of some 40 pages, will irritate many professional semioticists, but by not being technical enough, and for focusing on one dimension of semiotics, which semioticists, for whatever reason, are not accustomed to regard as a proper subject of inquiry. That is, not texts and other coded sign utterances, but the self which produces texts and hears sign utterances. For both Melville and Percy, the human element is key to understanding the pages that follow. For Melville, in particular, the image of the scientist as architect is vital for several reasons, because in it, Melville sees his own work as novelist, and for that reason he relies on the reader to collaborate in building from narrative skeleton the expansive and imaginative bulk of Moby Dick, both the whale and the tale. It is an attempt by Melville to invite the reader to examine the narrative as a hunting ground for the self, not just the ghostly white self, but the many other selves which make up Moby Dick through the eyes of Ishmael. The road is better than the inn, Cervantes said. True, Percy agrees, but he did not reckon with the ghostly travelers like the Flying Dutchman, or for that matter, Moby Dick. Note, however, that re-entry by travel, and also exile, nearly always takes place in a motion from a northern place to a southern place. And here we recall the Yuletide departure of the Pequod. Now it being Christmas, when the ship shot from out her harbor, for a space we had biting polar weather, though all the time running away from it to the southward. and to every degree and minute of latitude which we sailed, gradually leaving that merciless winter and all its intolerable weather behind us. This invitation to travel with Ishmael is bolstered by many of the same ploys which Percy uses in Lost in the Cosmos, including a battery of thought experiments similar to those which guide the reader through Percy's own exploration of the cosmos. On several occasions throughout the novel, Melville extemporizes with the reader, most memorably at the beginning when he asks why men are drawn to great bodies of water in the first place, the mysteries of the deep, and thereby contemplation of the cosmos. And again, when he discusses the universal symbolism of the color white. Are you one of the landsmen of weekdays pent up in laughing plaster, tied to counters, nailed to benches, clinched to desks? How then is this? Are the green fields gone? Why do they, by which we are to understand we, why do they hear? Why do we hear? Or are you in the country in some high land of lakes? Take almost any path you please, and 10 to 1 it carries you down to a dale and leaves you there by a pool in the stream. Let the most absent-minded of men be plunged into his deepest reveries. Stand that man on his legs and set his feet a-going, and he will infallibly lead you to water, if water there be in all that region. If ever, Melville advises, you are athirst in the great American desert, try this experiment, if your caravan happens to be supplied with a metaphysical professor. He includes other characters at home equally in Percy's work. The tourist drawn toward Niagara Falls, the poet who balances necessary things with the desire to see Rockaway Beach. Melville reaches further back, too, to the Persians, who held the sea holy, and the Greeks, who made the sea siblings to Zeus. Clearly, he sees it as a human situation or predicament. Surely all this is not without meaning, he continues. And still deeper, the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting, mild image he saw in the fountains, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in our rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. In fact, again, I would look at Narcissus as kind of the patron saint of the self. In just such a way, it can be argued, Percy saw in Melville a fellow traveler, one who saw in the sea, the cosmos, the only answer key to the riddles which first set Ishmael off on the Pequot, as a simple sailor, either passenger or commodore, but one of the anonymous multitudes for whom the sea is both a means and an end, that is, a means of employment, because as Ishmael reminds us, there's all the difference in the world between paying as a passenger and being paid as a sailor. And the end point of his overwhelming desire, the overwhelming idea of the great whale himself. And midmost of them all, one grand hooded phantom like a snow hill in the air. While of a more philosophically retired, if not metaphysical aspect, Ishmael's obsession with this snow hill in the air is every bit a part of the drama of Moby Dick as Captain Ahab's. For Ahab, though, the whale is the malevolent badge of the cosmos. For Ishmael, it becomes an occasion to establish the universal symbolism of the color white, and thereby of the whale itself. Why, to the man of untutored ideality, who happens to be loosely acquainted with the peculiar character of the day, does the barest mention of Whitenside marshal in the fancy such long, dreary, speechless processions of slow-pacing pilgrims, downcast and hooded with new-fallen snow? Is it that by the color white's indefiniteness, it shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation, while beholding the white depths of the Milky Way, the cosmos? In any case, Melville's intention is to elicit from the reader responses which are at once focused on the narrative at hand, while also grasping the philosophical truths inherent in the particulars. Like Percy, Melville was a writer who knew how to balance his fiction with his philosophy. In the end, Percy is right, of course. Melville doesn't provide any answer which are theologically sane enough to consider, at least on that level, but perhaps that's not the point of either Moby Dick or Percy's appreciation of Melville. In his examination of the depressed self, in Lost in the Cosmos, Percy writes of the man who survives his own suicide only to find himself washed up on a deserted isle. Are you not free for the first time in your life to consider the folly of man, the most absurd of all the species, and to contemplate the comic mystery of your own existence, and even to consider which is the more absurd state of affairs, lost in the cosmos, and no news of how you got into such a fix, or how to get out, or the even more preposterous eventuality that news did come from the god of the cosmos, who took pity on your ridiculous plight and entered the space and time of your insignificant planet to tell you something. In the Pequod's adventure, Ishmael never quite gets around to considering that second of the two absurdities. but he does find himself buoyed by the same irony which the Christian takes for granted, that by death comes new life. Or alternately, that in death we are saved. Round and round then, and ever contracting toward the button-like black bubble at the axis of that slowly wheeling circle, like another Ixion I did revolve, till gaining that vital center, the black bubble upward burst, and now, liberated by reason of its cunning spring, and owing to its great buoyancy, rising with great force, the coffin-life buoy shot lengthwise from the sea, fell over, and floated by my side. Buoyed up by that coffin for almost one whole day and night, I floated on a soft and dirge-like main. On the second day, a sail drew nearer, nearer, and picked me up at last. It was the devious cruising Rachel that in her retracing search after her missing children only found another orphan. Whether we are to take Ishmael's rescue as a sign of hope, or his self-characterization as an orphan as an indication that humanity remains lost in the cosmos, the exquisite ambiguity only throws in greater relief the fact that, like Percy, Melville correctly diagnosed man's predicament. It is insignificant to note a few things about Lost in the Cosmos, in conjunction with Moby Dick. As in Melville's book, Percy ends with a failed mission. The whale is not found, the distant planet is found to be uninhabitable. In both cases, the attempt to strike through the mask, as Ahab puts it, failed. Thus, where a single pulsar would go tick, 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 this message went something like tock, tick, tock, tick, 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 tock. A non-message fiendishly close to a message. And yet, for all that, Percy recognizes, and we must too, that Melville's own message is not a non-message. An allegory is a dreary business, Percy asserts. What is not dreary is a narrative that unfolds not merely by itself, not merely itself, but oneself and other selves. There's no straining for a symbol of truth. The narrative is the thing. That is why Moby Dick is so good, and The Confidence Man is so boring. This happiness of Melville in Moby Dick is the happiness of the artist discovering, breaking through into the freedom of his art. Through no particular virtue of his own, he hit on a mother lode. I want to take just one little aside here. There's another novel that he mentions in Melville too, or in his essay on Melville, called Pierre, which also was pretty dreadful. But I'd like to note one thing at least that, and this will be for a future study of either a Percy scholar or a Melville scholar. The basic premise of Pierre, and tell me if you've heard this one before, is a man is found with 3 women and he must choose among them. I've heard that before. Anyway, getting back to the point at hand. Once more, Vincent places his finger on the value Percy saw in Moby Dick. Throughout Moby Dick, Vincent writes, Melville progressively develops the theme of the isolated individual. The theme, the problem, the fact of isolation haunted the most sensitive minds of Melville's century, from Coleridge to Arnold, and from, wait for it, Emerson to Emily Dickinson. And it still hovers above the 20th century, and I might add the 21st century, a restless and unlaid ghost. Melville impresses Southern writers for the same reason Dostoevsky impresses Southern writers, Percy concludes in his Melville essay. Neither was afraid to deal with ultimate questions. It's perhaps no accident that Dostoevsky and Melville were almost perfect contemporaries. Born 2 years apart, they died within a decade of one another. And their shared concern for an answer to the splintered self only further highlights the profound discoveries Percy makes on that same search through the cosmos.
Can we take a few minutes and have some questions, comments?